Tonight we will embark on a gentle journey, not to a destination, but into presence. We will explore the timeless wisdom of the Buddha, teachings that have served as a refuge for restless minds for over 2,500 years. These are not rules to follow or doctrines to memorize. They are invitations. Invitations to see differently, to soften your grip, and to uncover the deep well of peace that has been within you all along. We will walk this path through ancient stories and simple, profound truths that speak not to the busy mind, but to the quiet, knowing heart. We will learn to see our thoughts not as masters, but as passing clouds, and our difficult emotions not as enemies, but as messengers inviting us toward healing. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is your sanctuary, a space to rest your mind and nourish your spirit. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, and no one you need to become. Simply allow these words to wash over you. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Please share in the comments below. If this path of quiet reflection calls to something deep within you, I invite you to subscribe to Buddha Bedtime Stories and return to this space whenever you need to remember the peace that is your birthright. These teachings are here for you, night after night, a refuge you can always return to. For now, just breathe. Let yourself settle completely. Feel the surface beneath you, holding your weight. Notice your breath moving naturally, asking nothing of you. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you exhale, let yourself arrive here fully. Let us begin this journey together. Our journey into deep peace begins with a gentle, honest look at the nature of our own minds. It starts with one of the most foundational teachings of the Buddha, in a mountain village where mist clung to the slopes like silk. There lived a tea master named Sozin, who had perfected his craft over 40 years. His reputation had spread across 3 provinces. People said that to drink tea prepared by Sozin was to taste enlightenment itself. One autumn morning, a young merchant named Kenji arrived at Sozin's simple tea house. Kenji wore expensive robes and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had succeeded early in life. He had read 7 books about the tea ceremony. He had attended demonstrations by famous masters in the capital. He had purchased the finest tea utensils money could buy. "Master Sozin," Kenji announced as he entered, not waiting to be invited in. "I have come to learn the secrets of tea ceremony. I've studied extensively, you see. I understand the basic principles, of course. What I need from you are the advanced techniques, the hidden knowledge that books don't contain." Sozin, who had been sitting quietly by the window watching leaves drift past, turned slowly and smiled. His face was deeply lined, kind, patient as stone. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the mat across from him. Kenji sat, but even in sitting, he radiated impatience. His eyes moved around the room, cataloguing, comparing, judging. The tea house was simpler than he had expected. Bare walls, plain cushions, nothing impressive at all. Sozin began to prepare tea with movements so natural they seemed like breathing. Each gesture flowed into the next without hesitation or thought. But before he could explain anything, Kenji interrupted. "Yes, I know about cleansing the implements. I've read about that. What I really want to understand is the spiritual dimension. The books mention it, but they are quite vague. Sozin nodded quietly and continued his preparation. He heated water. He measured tea. His hands moved with a grace that 40 years of daily practice had made effortless. Again, Kenji interrupted. I've been told there are different schools of thought about whisking technique. Which do you follow? I have my own theories about which is most authentic. The old master said nothing. He simply continued, reaching for a simple clay cup, placing it before his guest. Then he lifted the kettle and began to pour. The tea flowed into the cup, dark and fragrant. Steam rose. The cup filled to the brim. But Sozin didn't stop pouring. Tea spilled over the edges, pooling on the wooden tray. Still, Sozin poured. The pool spread wider, reaching the edge of the table. Tea began to drip onto the mat below. It soaked into Kenji's expensive robes. "Stop!" Kenji shouted, jumping back. "Can't you see the cup is full?" "No more will go in." Sozin set down the kettle carefully. He looked at Kenji with the same gentle expression he'd worn since the beginning. In his eyes was something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't quite sadness either. Just a deep, patient knowing. "Like this cup," he said softly. "You are full of your own opinions, your own ideas, your own certainty about what you already know. How can I show you anything new when there is no space inside you to receive it?" Kenji opened his mouth to argue, to explain that he wasn't full, that he was here to learn after all. But the words stopped in his throat. He looked down at his tea-soaked robes. He thought about how he had entered this room, already knowing what he would find, what he would learn, what the master would say. Had he come here to learn? Or had he come here to confirm what he already believed? "Every person who came to me this week," Sozin continued, his voice still soft, still kind, had an empty cup. They knew they didn't know. You are the first to arrive with a cup already full. Kenji sat back down slowly. The tea was still dripping from the table. The sound was like a small clock, marking moments. "Master," he said, and his voice was different now. Smaller, younger. "I don't know anything about tea at all, do I?" "You know many facts about tea," Sozin replied. "You have gathered information like autumn leaves in a basket. But knowing about tea is not the same as knowing tea. Understanding tea ceremony from books is like understanding the ocean from a map. The map has truth in it, yes, but it is not wet. It has no salt. It cannot carry you anywhere." He poured a fresh cup, this time stopping when the cup was full. "The tea ceremony is not about secrets or advanced techniques," Sozin explained. "It is about presence, attention, respect, humility. These are not complicated. A child can understand them, but they are difficult because they require us to empty ourselves first." Kenji looked at the fresh cup of tea before him. Steam rose from it in delicate spirals. He realized he had never actually paid attention to tea before. He had drunk it hundreds of times while thinking about business, reading scrolls, planning his next acquisition. He had attended tea ceremonies where he spent the entire time comparing the master's technique to what he'd read in books. But right now, in this moment, he was seeing tea for the first time. He lifted the cup with both hands, the way Sozin had shown him. He brought it to his lips slowly. He tasted it, really tasted it. The bitterness, the subtle sweetness beneath. the warmth spreading through his chest. "This is the first cup of tea I've ever drunk," he said quietly. Sozin smiled. "Yes, this is humility, not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. When you empty yourself of certainty, everything becomes new. Every cup of tea is the first cup. Every breath is the first breath." Kenji stayed with Sozin for 3 months. Each day he practiced emptying his cup. It was harder than he expected. His mind kept filling itself with opinions, judgments, comparisons. But slowly he learned. Not new techniques, but a new way of being present. Years later, when Kenji had his own students, they would notice something unusual about how he taught. He never claimed to have all the answers. He never said, "This is the only way." Instead, he would ask questions. He would create space for his students to discover on their own. When asked about his approach, he would smile and tell the story of a cup that overflowed. "My master taught me that learning begins with emptiness," he would say. "The moment we think we know everything is the moment we stop growing. So I try to keep my cup empty, always ready to be filled again." This teaching about emptiness, about humility, is one that serves us even now, even here, as we prepare for rest. How often do we approach each day, each moment, each person, already full of what we think we know? How often do we miss what's actually present because we're too busy confirming our expectations? Tonight, as you settle into rest, you might practice this same emptiness. Let go of what you think you know about sleep, about relaxation, about how this should feel. Empty your cup completely. And in that emptiness, something new can pour in. Something fresh, something true. In a bustling market town, there were 2 merchants who sold rice side by side. One was named Kenji, the other Taro. Both had successful businesses, both were known throughout the region. But their approaches to business could not have been more different. Kenji used scales that he had carefully adjusted to weigh slightly in his favor. Not much, just enough that most customers wouldn't notice. Over the course of a year, this small deception added significantly to his profits. He told himself everyone did it, that it was just smart business, that customers expected to be cheated a little and factored it into their calculations. Taro, on the other hand, used scales that were calibrated perfectly. He would even add a bit extra to each purchase, telling customers, "Better to give too much than too little." His profits were smaller than Kenji's, but his conscience was clear. Kenji would mock Taro privately. "You're a fool," he would say. "You could be making so much more. The customers don't know the difference. Why cheat yourself?" "I'm not cheating myself," Taro would reply. "I'm paying myself in peace of mind. Every transaction I make, I know I've been honest. That's worth more to me than extra profit." "Peace of mind doesn't feed your family," Kenji scoffed. "Money feeds your family." For years this continued. Kenji's business appeared more successful. He had a larger house, finer clothes, and more luxuries. Taro lived modestly, comfortable, but not wealthy. To outside observers, Kenji's approach seemed vindicated. Then one day, a wealthy lord came to the market to purchase rice for his household. He was known for being meticulous and for testing merchants' honesty. He had brought his own perfectly calibrated scales. He went first to Kenji's stall and purchased a measure of rice. Then he weighed it on his own scales. The shortage was immediately apparent. "Your scales are dishonest," the lord said coldly. Kenji's face went white. "My lord, there must be some mistake." "Perhaps your scales are inaccurate." "My scales are tested regularly by the Imperial Standards Office," the Lord replied. "Yours are deliberately fraudulent. Not only will I not purchase from you, but I will ensure that everyone in my household and in my social circle knows of your dishonesty." The Lord then went to Taro's stall and made the same purchase. When he weighed it on his own scales, he found that Taro had actually given more than the agreed upon amount. "Your scales are generous," the Lord said with approval. "I prefer to err on the side of giving too much," Taro replied simply. "Then you have earned my business and my recommendation," the Lord said. "From now on, all the rice for my household will be purchased from you, and I will tell others of your integrity." Within weeks, Taro's business had doubled, then tripled. The Lord's recommendation brought customers from the wealthiest families in the region. Meanwhile, Kenji's business collapsed. Once word spread about his dishonest scales, even his regular customers stopped coming. His reputation destroyed, he eventually had to close his stall. Years later, Kenji came to Taro humbled and seeking work. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought honesty was expensive, but dishonesty cost me everything." Taro hired him, but on one condition, that Kenji help maintain the scales, calibrating them regularly to ensure perfect accuracy. "You need to rebuild your relationship with honesty," Taro said. "Start here, with these scales. Every time you calibrate them, remember that integrity isn't about what others can see. It's about what you know about yourself." As Kenji worked with the honest scales day after day, something shifted in him. He had spent so many years cheating in small ways that he had forgotten what it felt like to be completely honest. The dishonesty had eaten at him in ways he hadn't even recognized, creating a constant low-level anxiety about being discovered, a subtle shame he carried everywhere. Now, working with honest scales, treating every customer fairly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Simple peace. No anxiety about being caught. No shame about his methods. No exhausting mental calculations about how much he could get away with. One day, a customer accidentally gave him too much money. The old Kenji would have pocketed it without comment. But now, without even thinking, he called the customer back and returned the extra coins. "You've changed," Taro observed, watching this exchange. "I'm remembering who I was before I started cheating," Kenji replied. "I forgot that honesty feels good, that it's actually easier than dishonesty because you don't have to remember your lies or worry about being discovered. I thought I was taking a shortcut to success, but I was actually taking a shortcut to misery." He looked at the scales, perfectly balanced. "These scales are the most honest thing in this market. They don't calculate or scheme or try to get away with anything. They just measure truly. I spent years being more clever than these scales and less wise." Taro nodded. The scales teach a simple lesson. Integrity is its own reward. Not because good things always happen to honest people, but because living with integrity creates internal peace that no amount of profit gained through dishonesty can match. You sleep better. You walk lighter. You meet people's eyes without flinching. These things have value that can't be measured in coins. A young merchant who was just starting came to Taro for advice. Everyone says I should adjust my scales just a little, that it's how business is done. But it feels wrong. What should I do? Taro had Kenji answer. I spent 20 years cheating, Kenji said, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to restore the character I damaged in myself. The extra profit wasn't worth it, not even close. Your scales are a mirror of your character. Keep them honest, and you keep yourself honest. Cheat them, and you cheat yourself in ways that matter far more than money. The young merchant looked at Kenji with curiosity. But didn't you make more money by cheating? For a while, Kenji admitted. But I lost it all when my dishonesty was discovered. More importantly, I lost something that took much longer to rebuild. My ability to respect myself. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a cheat. Every time I counted my profits, I knew they were partly stolen. Every interaction with customers involved acting, pretending, and hiding what I really was. It was exhausting and corrosive. He gestured to the perfectly balanced scales. These scales are at peace. They have nothing to hide, nothing to defend, nothing to remember or cover up. They just are what they are. That's what integrity gives you. The peace of being what you are, without pretense or deception. It's the most valuable thing I've learned, and I learned it the hard way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own scales. Where in your life are you adjusting the balance, even slightly in your own favor? Where are you being less than completely honest, with others or with yourself? These small dishonesties might seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They create a background noise of anxiety and shame that you carry everywhere. What would it feel like to calibrate your scales perfectly? To be completely honest, even when no one is watching, even when you could get away with a small deception. Not because of fear of being caught, but because integrity itself is the reward. Because living with honest scales creates an internal peace that no amount of clever advantage taking can provide. Rest tonight in honesty. Let go of all the small ways you've been adjusting the scales. Let go of the exhausting mental work of maintaining deceptions. Be like the perfectly balanced scale, true, honest, at peace with what you are. The reward isn't somewhere in the future. The reward is the immediate relief of no longer having to hide, to calculate, to worry about being discovered. Honest scales don't lie awake at night. Neither do honest hearts. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. "See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better. Yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. In a monastery where monks practiced intensive meditation, there was a monk named Genzo, who struggled more than any of the others. While his fellow monks seemed to make progress, reporting experiences of insight and clarity, Genzo felt nothing but confusion and exhaustion. He tried so hard. He would sit in meditation until his legs ached and his back screamed. He would concentrate fiercely, trying to force his mind into the states he read about in the sutras. He would stay up late studying, trying to understand intellectually what he couldn't grasp experientially. But nothing seemed to work. While others reported breakthrough moments, sudden insights, and powerful experiences during meditation, Genzo just felt tired. So tired that he would sometimes fall asleep during meditation sessions, which filled him with shame. The other monks were achieving enlightenment, and he couldn't even stay awake. The monastery's teacher, Master Dogen, watched Genzo's struggle with patient concern. He saw how the young monk was wearing himself out, how the desperate striving was actually creating obstacles rather than removing them. One day, after Genzo had fallen asleep during meditation yet again and woken up mortified, Dogen called him aside. "Genzo, you look exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night?" "I can't afford to sleep, Master. I'm so far behind the others. I need to practice more, not less." "Go to your room and sleep," Dogen said gently. "That's not a suggestion. It's an instruction. Sleep for as long as your body needs." Genzo was confused but obedient. He went to his room, lay down, and immediately fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He slept through the afternoon, through the evening meditation, through the night, and into the next morning. When he finally woke, something was different. He couldn't name what had changed, but the world looked somehow clearer. The desperate striving that had consumed him was just gone. He felt a quietness inside that he'd never experienced before. He went to find Dogen, unsure what to say about this strange shift. "Master, something happened while I slept, but I don't know what. I feel different, but I didn't have any dramatic experience, any sudden insight. I just slept." Dogen smiled. "And in that sleep, you let go of trying. You let go of the desperate effort to achieve enlightenment. You stopped fighting with yourself. And in that letting go, what was always there became apparent." "But I didn't do anything," Genzo protested. "I just slept." "The others have profound experiences during meditation. I fell asleep." "Enlightenment isn't always dramatic," Dogen explained. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it comes not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. You've been trying so hard to wake up that you couldn't see you were already awake. You needed to sleep, to let go, to stop trying. for what's always been true to become obvious. Over the following days, Genzo noticed that the peace hadn't left him. It wasn't a dramatic altered state. It was more like a background quietness, a sense of okayness that didn't depend on circumstances. The desperate seeking was gone, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had realized he'd never lost it. Other monks asked him what had happened. Did you have a breakthrough, a sudden awakening? I don't know, Genzo replied honestly. I just slept. And when I woke up, something had shifted. But it wasn't like lightning striking. It was more like clouds clearing and realizing the sky had been there all along. Master Dogen used Genzo's experience to teach others. Many of you are waiting for dramatic enlightenment experiences. Thunder and lightning, profound insights, altered states. But enlightenment is often more subtle than that. It's the quiet recognition of what's always been true. It's the simple shift from trying to be at peace to noticing the peace that's already here. Years later, when Genzo told his story to students, he would laugh at his younger self. I was trying so hard to wake up that I exhausted myself. I thought enlightenment was something to achieve through effort. But sometimes you have to stop trying to wake up and just let yourself sleep. Sometimes awakening comes through the door you're not watching. Tonight, stop trying so hard. Stop striving for perfect meditation or ideal relaxation or correct rest. Stop watching for enlightenment or breakthroughs or special experiences. Just sleep. Just let go. Just be tired and allow yourself rest without judgment. What you're seeking might come not through your effort, but through your willingness to stop efforting and simply be. Sleep through your own awakening if you must. It will be there when you wake. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a town famous for its craftsmen, there lived a clockmaker named Kenji who created timepieces of extraordinary precision. His clocks kept perfect time. His watches never gained or lost a second. People came from distant cities to purchase his work, and his reputation spread widely. But something happened to Kenji as his skill grew. He became obsessed with time in a way that began to consume his life. He would check his clocks constantly, comparing them against each other, anxious if any showed even the slightest deviation. He scheduled every moment of his day, allocating specific minutes to each task. He kept detailed records of how long everything took, analyzing his efficiency, trying to waste no time. His wife would call him for dinner, and he would arrive exactly at the scheduled moment, not a minute early or late. His children would ask him to play, and he would check his schedule, finding a 15-minute slot and setting a timer so he wouldn't run over. He measured everything, tracked everything, lived his entire life by the clock. People admired his discipline. Kenji wastes no time, they would say. He's so efficient, so organized. But his family felt differently. His wife felt like he was never really present, always watching the time, even during conversations. His children learned to stop asking him to play spontaneously, knowing he would need to check if that time was allocated. One day, Kenji's elderly father became very ill. Kenji visited him at the scheduled time each day, staying for exactly the planned duration. On what turned out to be his father's last day, Kenji was sitting beside the bed when his timer went off, indicating his visit slot was complete. I have to go, Kenji said, standing up. I have a client appointment in 20 minutes, and it takes 15 minutes to get there, so I need to leave now to be on time. His father looked at him with sad eyes. Kenji, I may not be here tomorrow. I know, Father. I'll come back tomorrow at 2 p.m. as scheduled. His father died that evening, while Kenji was home eating dinner at precisely 6 p.m. as his schedule dictated. At the funeral, Kenji's father's friend, an old Zen monk named Joshu, approached him. Your father loved you very much, Joshu said. I know, Kenji replied. I visited him every day. Did you? Joshu asked gently. Or did you visit the time slot you had allocated for visiting? Kenji felt something crack inside his chest. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. The monk was right. He had been there in body but not in presence. His mind had been on the clock, on the schedule, on the next appointment. He had measured out his love in timed portions, and now his father was gone, and all those precisely measured visits felt hollow. I wasted it, Kenji whispered. All that time I tracked so carefully, all that time I organized and measured, and I wasted the time that mattered. You didn't waste it, Joshu said, but you didn't fully live it either. You were so busy measuring time that you forgot to experience it. In his grief and shock, something shifted in Kenji. He went home and looked at all his clocks, all these devices he had spent years perfecting. They ticked away, measuring, dividing, tracking. And he realized they were measuring something that couldn't really be measured. A moment of real connection with his child had no measurable duration. The joy of a beautiful sunset didn't fit into scheduled slots. The depth of presence with another person couldn't be quantified in minutes and seconds. He had been living as if time were the most important thing, when actually what happened in time was what mattered. The next day, Kenji did something that shocked the town. He closed his clock shop. He put away his watches and timers. He stopped scheduling his days in measured blocks. His wife thought he had lost his mind. What will we do? How will we live? We'll live, Kenji said simply. Actually live. Not to measure our living. When I'm hungry, I'll eat. When I'm tired, I'll sleep. When our children want to play, I'll play. Not because it's scheduled, but because the moment calls for it. He still made clocks. It was his craft, his art, but he made them differently now. He would work on one until it felt complete, not until a timer said his work session was over. He would stop if he felt called to watch the sunset, or talk with a neighbor, or sit with his wife. He stopped trying to be efficient and started trying to be present. At first, this new way of living felt chaotic to him. Without schedules and timers, how would he know what to do? But gradually, he discovered a different kind of guidance. His body told him when to rest. His interest told him when to work. His relationships told him when a connection was needed. Life itself had a rhythm that didn't require clocks. His children noticed the change immediately. Their father would now play with them until the play naturally ended, not until a timer buzzed. He would listen to their stories without glancing at a watch. He was actually there, fully present, not counting the minutes until he could move to the next scheduled item. One evening, his daughter climbed into his lap and said, "Daddy, you're different now." "How so?" Kenji asked. "Before, you were here but not here. Now you're really here." Kenji felt tears in his eyes. "I'm learning," he said, "that being here is more important than being on time." Word spread about the clockmaker who had stopped caring about time. Some people thought he had gone mad. How could a clockmaker not care about time? But others were curious. They came to talk with him. "How do you live without schedules?" they asked. "How do you get everything done?" "I get done what needs to get done," Kenji replied. "But I've stopped confusing being busy with being productive. I've stopped measuring my worth by how efficiently I use time. Time isn't something to use or waste. It's what we live in. And I was so concerned with managing it that I forgot to inhabit it." He showed them the clocks he was making now. They were beautiful, functional, but somehow different. "These clocks can tell you what time it is," he explained, "but they can't tell you what to do with that time. They can measure duration, but not meaning. I made the mistake of letting the measurer become the master. The clock told me how to live, rather than serving my living." Joshu the monk visited Kenji's workshop months after the funeral. He watched Kenji work for a while, noticing the quality of attention the clockmaker brought to his craft, the way he would pause to watch light move across his workbench, the way he seemed fully engaged with what he was doing. "You've learned your father's final teaching," Joshu said. "What teaching?" "That life can't be saved up or stored or perfectly managed. It can only be lived moment by moment with full presence or with partial presence. Your father's death reminded you that the time we have is uncertain, and that measuring it carefully doesn't make it last longer or mean more. Only living it fully does that." Kenji nodded. "I used to think I was honoring time by tracking it so carefully. But I was actually dishonoring it. I was treating time as an enemy to be managed rather than a gift to be received. I was so afraid of wasting time that I wasted life." Years later, people still bought Kenji's clocks, but they also came to him for a different kind of wisdom. They would ask, "How do I find more time?" And he would reply, "You can't find more time. You can only be more present to the time you have. Stop measuring and start experiencing. Stop tracking and start living." The clock is useful for coordination, for knowing when to meet others, and for practical matters. But it's a terrible master. Don't let it tell you that measured time is more valuable than experienced time. Tonight, as you rest, notice if you're measuring. Are you tracking how long it takes you to fall asleep? Are you calculating how many hours of rest you'll get? Are you monitoring your progress toward relaxation? What if you stopped measuring and started experiencing? What if this moment of rest didn't need to be timed or tracked or evaluated? What if you could simply be here, in this unmeasured moment, present to breath and sensation without any concern for duration? Your life is not a clock to be wound and measured. It's an experience to be lived and felt. Tonight, forget time. Let yourself drift into timelessness, where there's no past to regret and no future to plan for. Just this eternal now that needs no measurement because it simply is. Rest in the unmeasured moment. That's where real life happens. Not in the counted minutes, but in the presence that fills them. There was a man named Jiro who dreamed of sailing around the coastal waters of his province. He spent years preparing for this journey. He studied navigation, learned about weather patterns, and read accounts of other sailors' voyages. He purchased the best boat he could afford and spent months modifying it, adding improvements and ensuring everything was perfect. He would tell his friends, "I'm almost ready. Just a few more things to prepare." Years passed. The boat sat in its slip, pristine and unused. Jiro continued preparing, planning, improving, getting ready for the journey he would take soon. An old sailor who lived nearby watched this for several years. Finally, he approached Jiro one morning as the man was polishing brass fittings on his perpetually docked boat. "Beautiful boat," the old sailor said. "Thank you," Jiro replied proudly. "I've put a lot of work into it. I'm almost ready to sail." "Almost ready?" the sailor repeated. "I've heard you say that for 5 years now. What exactly are you waiting for?" Jiro looked uncomfortable. "I want everything to be perfect. I want to be completely prepared. I don't want to make mistakes." "Let me tell you something," the old sailor said. "I've sailed these waters for 40 years. My boat has never been perfect. I've never been completely prepared. I've made countless mistakes, but I've sailed. And you, with your perfect boat and your complete preparation, have never left the dock. So who's really the sailor here?" Jiro felt defensive. "But what if something goes wrong? What if I'm not ready?" "Something will go wrong," the sailor said. "You won't be ready. That's not a possibility, that's a certainty. The sea doesn't wait for you to be ready, and preparation only teaches you so much. Most of what you need to know, you learn by sailing, not by preparing to sail." He patted the boat's rail. "This boat is dying here at the dock. It was built to sail. You were built to sail. But both of you are sitting here, trapped by your fear of imperfection, your need for complete readiness. And while you wait for the perfect conditions, for total preparation, your life is passing." That evening, Jiro sat on his boat as the sun set, thinking about the old sailor's words. How many perfect days had he missed while preparing? How many adventures had he postponed waiting for complete readiness? How much of his life had he spent getting ready to live rather than actually living? The next morning, without overthinking it, Jiro untied his boat and sailed out of the harbour. His hands were shaking. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he sailed anyway. He made mistakes that first day. He misjudged a turn and nearly ran into another boat. He didn't account properly for wind and had to adjust his course several times. But he sailed. He actually sailed. And it was glorious. Over time, Jiro became a competent sailor. Not perfect, never perfect, but competent. And he realized that if he had waited until he felt completely ready, he would have waited forever. Because readiness isn't a destination you reach through preparation. It's a decision you make despite uncertainty. Tonight, what have you been preparing for but never started? What perfect conditions are you waiting for before you allow yourself to rest, to heal, to change, to grow? What if you'll never feel completely ready? What if the preparation itself has become the obstacle? Let yourself sail tonight. Into sleep, into rest, into whatever comes next. Not perfectly prepared, not completely ready, just willing. That's enough. That's all it takes. Stop preparing and start sailing. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. "I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it." Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal. In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing, she told students. Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. In a farming village, there lived a man named Ichiro, who worked a small plot of land that had been in his family for generations. The land was good, fertile and well positioned, except for one problem. Right in the middle of his best field sat an enormous stone, far too large to move. Ichiro's grandfather had farmed around it. His father had farmed around it. Now Ichiro farmed around it, losing valuable growing space to this immovable obstacle. Every planting season, he would curse the stone. Every harvest, he would calculate how much more rice he could have grown if that useless rock wasn't taking up space. Other farmers would commiserate with him. "What bad luck," they would say, "to have such a stone in your best field." Ichiro would nod bitterly, agreeing that the stone was his misfortune, a burden he had inherited and could do nothing about. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Streams dried up. Wells ran low. The sun beat down mercilessly and crops withered in the fields. Farmers watched helplessly as their year's work shriveled under the relentless heat. Ichiro was working in his field one afternoon, trying to save what plants he could with his limited water, when he noticed something. The crops growing on the north side of the large stone, in its shadow, were still green. While plants in full sun were dying, the ones protected by the stone's shade during the hottest part of the day were surviving. Ichiro sat down on the stone, really looking at it for the first time in years. This useless obstacle had just saved a portion of his crop. The shadow he had never paid attention to, the shade he had never valued, was the difference between some harvest and no harvest. As the drought continued, Ichiro began using the stone strategically. He planted his most vulnerable crops on its shaded side. He stored water containers against it, where the shade kept the water cooler. He rested against it during the hottest hours, conserving his energy in its shelter. By the end of that difficult season, Ichiro had one of the better harvests in the village. His neighbors asked him his secret, and he pointed to the stone. "That stone," they said. "But you've always cursed that stone. You've always called it useless." "I was wrong," Ichiro replied simply. "I called it useless because I was only thinking about what I wanted to use it for. I wanted the space it occupied. I wanted to plant where it stood, but the stone was never useless. I was just blind to its uses. It was providing shade, shelter, coolness. All along it had value. I just couldn't see it because I was so focused on what it prevented me from doing." A traveling monk who heard this story stayed to talk with Ichiro. "This is a profound teaching," the monk said. "We spend our lives surrounded by things we call useless, obstacles we resent, circumstances we wish were different. But often these things have value we don't recognize because we're only looking at them from one angle, in one season, for one purpose." Ichiro nodded. "I spent 20 years hating that stone, 20 years of resentment and frustration. And all that time, the stone was just being stone. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It wasn't deliberately in my way. It was just there, and it had qualities I never bothered to notice because I decided from the beginning that it was an obstacle." The monk smiled. "The stone didn't change. Your circumstances changed, which changed what you needed, which changed what you could see. In seasons of plenty, shade seems worthless. In drought, it becomes precious. The stone's value was always there. You just needed different eyes to see it." Over the following years, Ichiro's relationship with the stone completely transformed. He built a small shelter against it, where he could rest during work. Children from the village would play on it, climbing its sides. His wife would hang, washing on lines attached to it, using its height and the wind that flowed around it to dry clothes quickly. In winter, its mass absorbed sun during the day and radiated warmth in the evening. The stone that had seemed like nothing but an obstacle became the center of the farm's life. Ichiro would sit against it in the evening, feeling its sun-warmed surface against his back, and marvel at his former blindness. "I thought I knew what this stone was," he would tell visitors. "I thought it was useless, in the way, bad luck. But I was judging it by one criterion only. Could I plant rice where it stood? When the answer was no, I stopped looking. I never asked what else it might offer. I never wondered if it had value I wasn't seeing. I just decided it was worthless and carried that judgment for 20 years." A young farmer came to Ichiro for advice, complaining about his own problems. His field was too shady, too many trees, not enough open space for crops. "I'll never be successful," the young man said bitterly. "My land is wrong for farming." Ichiro took him to see the stone. "This stone was wrong for my purposes too, until the day it wasn't, until the day circumstances revealed value I had never seen. Your shady field might be wrong for rice, but what might it be right for? What grows well in shade? What animals prefer forest? What uses does shade have that open sun doesn't?" He placed his hand on the stone. "Don't spend 20 years resenting what you have, because it isn't what you wish you had. Look more carefully, change your angle. wait for different seasons. Most things have value. We just don't always have the eyes to see it, or the circumstances that reveal it. The young farmer took this teaching to heart. Instead of trying to clear his shady land for rice, he planted mushrooms, which thrived in the dim forest floor. He kept bees, which loved the diverse flowers that grew in the dappled light. He harvested medicinal herbs that required shade. Within a few years, he was more prosperous than the farmers with better land, because he had learned to work with what he had instead of resenting what he didn't have. Ichiro's stone became something of a local landmark. People would visit it, touch it, and remember to look at their own lives differently. What obstacles were they carrying resentment toward? What circumstances were they calling useless or unfortunate? What value might be present that they hadn't yet recognized? An old woman who came to see the stone told Ichiro, "I spent my whole life thinking my lack of children was a tragedy, a lack, a failure. But in my old age, I realized it gave me freedom to help many children in the village, to be a grandmother to dozens of families. What I thought was missing created space for something I never planned. Like your stone, my childlessness had value I couldn't see until I stopped judging it as purely negative." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the stones in your own field, the obstacles you resent, the circumstances you wish were different, the qualities about yourself you judge as useless or wrong. What if these things have value you haven't yet recognized? What if they're serving purposes you can't see from your current angle? You don't have to love your obstacles or pretend difficulties aren't difficult, but you might hold judgment more lightly. This thing you call useless might be providing shade you've never noticed. This quality you call a flaw might be a strength in circumstances you haven't encountered yet. This obstacle you've been cursing might be exactly what saves you in a season you can't yet imagine. Rest now in acceptance of the stones in your field. They're not going anywhere, fighting them, resenting them, wishing them away. These are just ways of suffering over what is. But looking at them freshly, wondering about hidden value, staying open to different perspectives, this is the way of peace. The stone doesn't need to move. Your eyes need to open. And in that opening, what seemed useless reveals itself as useful. What seemed like bad luck reveals itself as good fortune in disguise. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a monastery famous for its scholarly debates and philosophical discussions, there arrived a new student named Mei who puzzled everyone by her silence. While other students constantly asked questions, challenged teachings, and engaged in elaborate discussions about Buddhist philosophy, Mei simply listened, nodded, and returned to her meditation. The other students found this frustrating. They were proud of their intellectual engagement, their ability to analyze complex concepts, and their sophisticated questions. Mei's silence seemed like a criticism of their approach, or worse, like she wasn't intelligent enough to participate. One day, after a particularly intense discussion about the nature of emptiness, a senior student named Takeo approached Mei. "You never ask questions," he said. "Don't you have doubts? Don't you want to understand these teachings more deeply?" Mei looked at him with clear, calm eyes. "I understand enough to practice," she said simply. "But there's so much complexity, so many layers of meaning. How can you not have questions? I have one question, May replied. Am I suffering less? If my practice reduces suffering, then I'm understanding. If not, then no amount of questions and answers will help. Takeo was taken aback. He realized that despite all his questions and discussions, despite his vast accumulation of knowledge about Buddhist philosophy, he was just as anxious, just as unsettled as when he had arrived at the monastery. He knew more, certainly, but he suffered no less. The monastery's abbot, Master Gensho, had been observing May quietly. Unlike the other students who sought her out for teaching constantly, May seemed to learn by watching, by practicing, by experiencing directly, rather than by asking for explanations. One afternoon, Master Gensho was working in the garden when May came to help him. They worked together in silence for an hour, pulling weeds, tending plants. Finally, Gensho spoke. You don't ask questions like the others. Why? May continued her work for a moment before responding. When I'm thirsty, I drink water. I don't ask about the chemistry of H2O or debate the philosophical implications of thirst. The direct experience of drinking satisfies thirst in a way that talking about water never could. She pulled another weed carefully, examining its roots before setting it aside. The other students have many questions about enlightenment, about emptiness, about the nature of mind. But they could discuss these things forever and never experience what the words point toward. I'd rather practice one moment with full attention than discuss 1,000 concepts about practice. Gensho smiled. You understand something they haven't yet learned. The teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. Most people study the finger endlessly, analyzing it, asking questions about it, debating its exact position. But you're looking where the finger points. May nodded. I watch you, she said simply. The way you move through the garden with full attention. The way you respond to people with presence rather than scripted wisdom. The way you sit in meditation without strain or performance. These teach me more than any discussion could. What have you learned by watching? Gensho asked. That peace doesn't come from understanding everything intellectually. It comes from being fully present to what is. That wisdom isn't accumulated knowledge, but direct seeing. That the questions that seem so important eventually dissolve when you stop feeding them with attention and instead simply practice. She paused in her work, looking at the master directly. The other students ask you hundreds of questions. I have only one. Am I doing the practice correctly? And your answer is in how you nod or don't nod when you see me sitting. That's all I need. Over the following years, something interesting happened. The students who had asked the most questions, who had engaged in the most elaborate discussions, often left the monastery still searching, still unsatisfied, still believing that the answer was in some concept they hadn't yet grasped. But May stayed, and her practice deepened. She didn't become a great scholar or a famous teacher, but people noticed a quality in her presence, a settledness that comes from direct understanding rather than intellectual knowledge. When Master Gensho became too old to teach, he surprised everyone by naming May as his successor. The scholarly students were bewildered. She had never demonstrated vast knowledge or sophisticated understanding. She had barely spoken in all her years at the monastery. At the ceremony, one bold student asked, Master May, you never asked questions like we did. You never engaged in the discussions and debates that we thought were so important. Why should you lead us? May looked at the gathered students with gentle eyes. You learned about Buddhism, she said quietly. I learned Buddhism. There's a difference. She picked up a cup of water. If you're thirsty, and someone describes water to you in elaborate detail, explains its molecular structure, debates its philosophical significance, are you satisfied, or do you need to drink? She drank from the cup, then set it down. For years you've been studying descriptions of water while remaining thirsty. I just drank. Not because I'm smarter or better, but because I stopped believing that understanding the description was the same as tasting the reality. She looked around at them all. You can stay here and continue to ask questions if you wish. Questions are not wrong. Discussion is not wrong. But eventually, you might notice that the mind that asks endless questions is avoiding the practice that would make the questions unnecessary. Eventually, you might discover that some things can only be understood by direct experience, not by intellectual analysis. One student asked, "But how do we know if we're practicing correctly if we don't ask questions?" "Practice and watch what happens," May replied. "Are you kinder? Are you more patient? Are you suffering less? Is there more peace in your heart? These are not things you know by asking questions. These are things you know by looking honestly at your own experience." She stood to leave, then paused. "I'll tell you one more thing I learned by not asking questions. When your mind is quiet, when it's not constantly generating inquiries and debates and analysis, you can hear something deeper. You can hear the teaching that's always present, that doesn't need words, that comes from direct contact with reality itself. That's the teaching I chose to listen to." Tonight, as you rest, you might notice your own questioning mind. How many questions are running through your thoughts? Questions about tomorrow, about your life, about whether you're doing things right, about what it all means. What would happen if you let those questions rest for these hours of sleep? What if, instead of asking and analyzing and trying to figure everything out, you experience this moment directly? You don't need to understand everything to rest. You don't need to have all the answers to be at peace right now. Sometimes the wisest response to life's complexity is not another question, but a quiet presence. Not more analysis, but more direct experiencing. Not more words, but more silence in which to hear what words can never say. Let your questions burn themselves out tonight. Let your seeking mind rest. And in that rest, you might discover what May discovered. That direct experience often teaches what endless inquiry never can. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive. He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. The crooked wall saved my life, Takeo would tell students, not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. "It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard." The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village where bread was the staple food, there lived a baker named Tomoe, who had learned the craft from her mother and grandmother. She took great pride in her work, waking before dawn each day to prepare dough, tend the oven, and produce loaves that the village depended on. Tomoe had baked thousands of loaves over the years, and she rarely made mistakes anymore. Her hands knew the feel of properly kneaded dough. Her eyes could judge oven temperature by the color of the fire. Her timing was precise. Day after day, she produced bread that was consistently good, reliable, exactly what people expected. But one morning, something went wrong. A neighbor had stopped by to talk just as Tomo was loading loaves into the oven. Distracted by the conversation, she forgot about the bread. By the time she remembered, smoke was pouring from the oven. She pulled out loaf after loaf of burnt bread, each one blackened and ruined. Tomo was devastated. In 15 years of baking, she had never destroyed an entire day's batch. The waste of ingredients troubled her. The loss of income for the day worried her, but most of all, her pride was wounded. She had been perfect for so long, and now she had failed in the most basic way. She sat among the burnt loaves, feeling terrible. Her young apprentice, a girl named Kiku, came in and saw the disaster. "What happened?" Kiku asked. "I forgot," Tomo said miserably. "I was distracted and I forgot. After 15 years of baking, I made a beginner's mistake." Kiku picked up one of the burnt loaves, examining it. "So this is what happens when bread stays in the oven too long." "Yes, it's completely ruined, worthless." But Kiku was looking at it with fascination. She had been apprenticing for 6 months and had never seen burnt bread before. Tomo was so skilled that mistakes never happened in her presence. "How much too long was it in there?" Kiku asked. Tomoe thought. "Perhaps 10 minutes passed when I should have removed it." And what if it had been 5 minutes too long instead of 10? Tomoe considered this. She had actually never experimented with deliberately over-baking bread, so she wasn't certain. "I suppose it would be burnt, but less severely. Could it still be eaten if it were only 5 minutes over? Perhaps if you cut away the worst parts." Kiku set down the burnt loaf and picked up another. "And this one is burnt differently than that one. Why?" Tomo looked more carefully at the loaves she had been too upset to really examine. Kiku was right. They had been in different parts of the oven, so they had burnt in different ways. Some were charred uniformly. Others were only burnt on one side. Some had burnt crusts but soft interiors. Each loaf told a story about where it had been in the oven and how fire had affected it. "I've been baking for 6 months," Kiku said, "and I've only learned how to do things right. I've never learned what happens when things go wrong, but you just learned more in one mistake than I've learned in weeks of getting it right." Tomo looked at her young apprentice with new appreciation. The girl had wisdom beyond her years. "You're right," Tomo said slowly. "I've been so focused on perfection that I've stopped learning. Every loaf I bake comes out the same. I'm not growing or discovering anything new. I'm just repeating what I already know how to do." She stood up and examined the burnt loaves more systematically. "This one," she said, pointing, "was at the back of the oven where it's hottest. It burnt fastest. These along the side got less direct heat. They took longer to burn. And this one right in front, it actually caught fire briefly before I pulled it out." Kiku watched her teacher transform from defeated to curious, from ashamed to engaged. "You know what?" Tomo said. "I'm going to deliberately burn some bread. Different amounts, different positions in the oven, different types of dough. I'm going to learn what I don't know because I've been too careful to ever make these mistakes." Over the following weeks, Tomo conducted experiments that would have horrified her former perfectionist self. She deliberately overbaked loaves to see what happened. She underbaked some. She tried different temperatures, different positions in the oven, different lengths of time. She made every mistake she could think of, carefully observing the results. What she learned transformed her baking. She discovered that what she had called perfect was actually just one point on a spectrum of possibilities. She found that slightly underbaked bread had a chewier texture that some people preferred. She learned that bread with a darker crust had a richer flavor. She discovered techniques she never would have tried if she hadn't been forced out of her perfect routine by that first mistake. Her bread became more varied, more interesting, more responsive to what different customers wanted. People who had been eating her consistently good bread for years suddenly found themselves excited by it again. "What changed?" they would ask. "Your bread seems different lately." Tomo would smile and say, "I finally made a mistake. And that mistake taught me more than years of getting it right." One day, a traveling baker who was considered a master of the craft stopped at Tomo's shop. He tasted her bread and was impressed. "You understand bread deeply," he said. "How did you learn so much?" "I burnt a whole day's batch," Tomo replied, "and instead of just feeling bad about it, I decided to learn from it. That mistake opened doors I didn't even know existed." The master baker nodded knowingly. The problem with being good at something is that you stop making mistakes. And when you stop making mistakes, you stop learning. You just keep repeating what you already know. It's the mistakes, if you pay attention to them, that show you what you don't yet understand. He looked around at her thriving shop. People think mastery means never making mistakes, but real mastery comes from making mistakes consciously, learning from them, and letting them teach you what success never can. Years later, when Kiku had become a skilled baker herself and taken over Tomo's shop, she would tell new apprentices about the day of the burnt bread. "My teacher was perfect for 15 years, she would say, and in those 15 years, her skill barely grew. But one mistake, one moment of failure, opened up years of new learning. Don't fear mistakes. Pay attention to them. They're often more valuable teachers than success." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own burnt bread, the mistakes you've made, the failures you've experienced, the times things went wrong. Are you still punishing yourself for these mistakes? Still seeing them only as evidence of inadequacy? What if those mistakes were actually your best teachers? What if failure, when you pay attention to it, reveals possibilities that success keeps hidden? What if the things you did wrong showed you more than all the things you did right? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get everything right. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is make a mistake, pay attention to what happens, and let it teach you what you couldn't learn any other way. Rest now in acceptance of your imperfect humanity. Your mistakes are not failures. They're experiments. They're lessons. They're the burnt bread that teaches you something new about the oven of your own life. Let them nourish your wisdom instead of poisoning your peace. There was a water bearer in a mountain village who carried water from the stream to the town each day. She used a wooden pole across her shoulders with a large pot hanging from each end. One pot was perfect, without flaw, and always delivered a full portion of water at journey's end. The other pot had a crack running down one side, and by the time the water bearer reached town, it was only half full. This went on for 2 years. The perfect pot was proud of its accomplishment, delivering full measures each day, fulfilling the purpose for which it was made. The cracked pot was ashamed of its imperfection, distressed that it could only do half of what it was meant to do. Finally, the cracked pot spoke to the water-bearer one morning by the stream. "I am ashamed of myself. I apologize to you." "Why?" asked the water-bearer. "What are you ashamed of?" "For 2 years, I have been able to deliver only half my load because this crack in my side causes water to leak out all the way back to town. Because of my flaw, you have to do more work and you don't get full value for your efforts." The water-bearer smiled kindly. "As we return to town today, I want you to notice the flowers along the path." As they walked up the hill from the stream, the cracked pot did notice the beautiful wildflowers growing along one side of the path. This cheered it somewhat, but at the end of the trail it still felt bad because it had leaked out half its water again. The water-bearer said to the pot, "Did you notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path, but not on the other pot's side? That's because I've always known about your crack, and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day, while we've walked back, you've watered them. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate my home and to sell at market. Without you being just the way you are, I would not have this beauty to grace my life." The cracked pot was silent, absorbing this revelation. What it had thought was its greatest weakness had been serving a purpose all along. The crack that made it imperfect for one purpose made it perfect for another purpose it never knew existed. A student who heard this story asked the local Zen teacher, "But wouldn't it have been better if the pot had no crack? Then the water-bearer would have had twice as much water and could have watered the flowers separately." The teacher smiled. "You're thinking of efficiency. The story is teaching about purpose. The cracked pot thought its only purpose was to carry water to town. It judged itself a failure at this purpose, but it was also watering flowers, creating beauty, serving a function it never imagined. What appears to be failure at one purpose may be success at a different purpose we don't yet recognize." The teacher continued, "Most of us are like the cracked pot. We have flaws, weaknesses, places where we leak, ways we don't measure up to our idea of what we should be. We judge ourselves harshly for these cracks. But often, these very flaws are serving purposes we cannot see. The things we think make us inadequate may be making us exactly adequate for something we don't yet understand." A woman in the village heard this teaching and thought about her own life. She had always been too sensitive, too easily moved to tears, too affected by others' suffering. In a society that valued stoicism and emotional control, she felt defective. She tried to toughen up, to be stronger, to not leak emotions everywhere she went. But then she noticed something. The very sensitivity she judged as weakness made her extraordinarily good at caring for those who were ill or grieving. People who were suffering would seek her out because her emotional openness created a safe space for their own grief. Her tears gave others permission to cry. Her tender heart helped heal other tender hearts. She was a cracked pot, yes, leaking emotional responses all along the path. But in her wake, flowers of compassion and healing grew. What she had thought was her failure was actually serving a purpose she had never imagined. A man in the village had a different crack. He couldn't focus on one thing for long. His mind would jump from interest to interest, never specializing, never becoming an expert in anything. In a society that valued mastery and deep expertise, he felt scattered and inadequate. But then he recognized what his crack had created. Because he knew a little about many things, he could connect ideas across different fields. He could see patterns that specialists missed. He could translate between different domains of knowledge, creating bridges where others saw only walls. The very quality he had judged as inability to focus was actually ability to see relationships. His crack was watering flowers he had never noticed. The teacher who told the story of the cracked pot would say, "Before you try to fix yourself, before you work so hard to seal up all your cracks, pause. Ask yourself, what is this crack watering? Where are flowers growing because of my imperfections? What purposes might I be serving that I haven't recognized because I'm so busy judging myself as broken?" This doesn't mean we shouldn't work on genuine problems or grow beyond destructive patterns, but it means we should look carefully at what we think are flaws. Sometimes what appears to be a weakness is actually a strength in disguise. Sometimes what we're failing at in one area, we're succeeding at in another area we haven't valued or noticed. The perfect pot in the story delivered water reliably, but it created no beauty. It fulfilled its intended function, but nothing more. The cracked pot, by failing at perfect water delivery, succeeded at something the perfect pot could never do. It made flowers grow. Tonight, as you rest, you might think about your own cracks, the ways you leak, the places you feel inadequate or broken. Instead of judging these cracks harshly, you might ask, what flowers might these cracks be watering? What beauty might be growing along the path of my imperfection? You are not meant to be a perfect vessel that holds everything in. You are meant to be authentically yourself, cracks and all. And those cracks, those places where you leak, those ways you fail to be perfect, they might be creating more beauty in the world than you realize. Rest now in acceptance of your cracked nature. You don't need to be sealed up and perfect. You're serving purposes you don't even know about, watering flowers you can't see, creating beauty through the very imperfections you judge so harshly. You are enough, cracks and all. More than enough. You are exactly what the world needs you to be. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a village known throughout the region for its ceramics, there lived a potter named Fumiko, who had inherited her father's workshop and his reputation for perfection. Her father had been famous for creating bowls so symmetrical, so flawless, that wealthy merchants would travel for days to purchase them. Every curve was exact. Every glaze was even. Every piece was a testament to complete control over the materials and process. Fumiko had learned her father's techniques perfectly. She could throw a bowl on the wheel with such precision that it seemed made by compass and ruler rather than human hands. She could apply glazes so evenly that no variation of color disturbed the surface. Her work was impeccable, and her success reflected that. Orders came from nobles and temples. Her workshop prospered. But Fumiko herself was miserable. Each piece she created felt lifeless to her, though she couldn't explain why. They were beautiful, yes, Perfect, certainly. But holding one of her bowls felt like holding a cold stone. There was no warmth in them, no personality, no soul. They were technically masterful, but somehow empty. She tried to push these feelings away. After all, people praised her work constantly. They paid premium prices. They displayed her bowls in places of honor. Who was she to feel dissatisfied when she had achieved everything her father had taught her to achieve? One autumn, a traveling monk stopped at Fumiko's workshop. He was old, his robes worn but clean, his face weathered by years of walking mountain paths. He asked if he might trade a blessing for a simple bowl to carry his daily rice. Fumiko, who gave generously to monks, brought out one of her perfect bowls. "Please, take this, it's my gift." The monk held it, turning it slowly in his hands. His face was unreadable. "Is something wrong?" Fumiko asked. "It's very beautiful," the monk said carefully. "Very perfect." But where is the potter in this bowl? I see perfection, but I don't see you. Fumiko felt something crack open inside her chest. This stranger had spoken aloud the very thing she had been feeling but couldn't name. "I don't understand," she said. Though she did. She absolutely did. The monk set down the perfect bowl and pulled from his bag an old tea bowl he carried. It was rough, clearly handmade, with an uneven rim and a glaze that had run in unexpected ways during firing. There was a spot where the potter's thumb had pressed into the soft clay, leaving a permanent impression. The bowl was crooked, sitting unevenly when placed on the table. "This bowl," the monk said, "was made by a potter who had nothing to prove. Look here." He pointed to the thumbprint. "I can see the exact moment when the clay was soft and the potter was human, and the two touched. This bowl tells me a story. It speaks of someone who was fully present while making it, not worried about perfection, just engaged with clay and water and fire." He lifted it to his lips, pretending to drink. "When I use this bowl, I'm touching that potter's humanity. The imperfection is not a flaw. It's a signature. It's proof that a real person, with real hands, in a real moment, made this thing." He looked at Fumiko's perfect bowl again. "Your bowl could have been made by a machine. It reveals nothing of you. It hides you behind perfect technique. It's beautiful, but it's also lonely." The monk thanked Fumiko for her generosity and continued on his way, taking her perfect bowl with him. But his words stayed in her workshop like smoke, impossible to ignore. That evening, Fumiko sat at her wheel with a fresh ball of clay. She began to throw a bowl, but this time she did something different. When her hand slipped slightly, creating a small wobble in the rim, she didn't smooth it away. She left it. When a bit of glaze dripped unevenly during application, she let it drip. When her thumb pressed too hard in one spot, leaving an impression, she allowed it to remain. Every instinct she had, every lesson from her father, screamed at her to fix these flaws. But she resisted. She let the bowl be what it wanted to be, imperfect and honest and human. When it came out of the kiln, Fumiko held it with trembling hands. It was crooked. One side was slightly higher than the other. The glaze was uneven, darker in some places, lighter in others. There was a clear thumbprint in the clay and a small crack that had formed during firing but hadn't broken all the way through. By every standard she had been taught, this bowl was a failure. But as she held it, turning it slowly in the light, she felt something she had never felt holding her perfect bowls. She felt moved. This bowl had a presence. It spoke of the afternoon she had made it, the way the light had come through the window, the mood she had been in, the questions turning in her mind. It was unique in all the world. Every other bowl she had ever made could be reproduced, but this one, with its specific flaws and accidents and human touches, could never be made again. She set it on her shelf, not for sale, just to look at. The next day, a customer came to the workshop, a tea master from the capital who had purchased Fumiko's bowls for years. "Show me your new work," he said. Fumiko brought out her usual pieces, perfect and symmetrical, but the tea master's eyes drifted past them to the crooked bowl on the shelf. "That one," he said. "May I see that one?" "Oh, that's not for sale," Fumiko said quickly. "It's flawed. I was just experimenting." "Please," the tea master insisted. Reluctantly, Fumiko brought down the crooked bowl. The tea master held it, and his face transformed. He turned it slowly, examining every imperfection with what looked like delight. "This," he said softly, "is the first piece of yours that has made me feel something. Your other bowls are impressive. They showcase your skill. But this bowl has wabi-sabi." Wabi-sabi? Fumiko had heard the term, but never fully understood it. "The beauty of imperfection," the tea master explained. "The aesthetic of the impermanent, the incomplete, the imperfect. In tea ceremony, we value this quality above all others. A perfect bowl is cold. It intimidates. It makes you afraid to use it, afraid to break it. But a bowl like this..." He cradled the crooked bowl gently. "This invites you to hold it, to use it, to accept its nature and your own nature as equally flawed and equally beautiful." He looked at Fumiko seriously. "I will pay you 10 times your usual price for this bowl, and I hope you will make more like it." Fumiko found herself saying no. She couldn't explain why, but she wasn't ready to sell that bowl. It had taught her something she was still learning. Over the following months, Fumiko began to experiment with allowing imperfection. Not sloppiness, she still worked with care and skill, but she stopped trying to control every variable. She let the clay speak. She let the fire decide some things. She let her own humanity show in the work. Some pieces came out more crooked than others. Some were more symmetrical. No two were alike. And all of them had something her perfect bowls had never had. They had soul. They had presence. They revealed the person who made them. Her old customers were confused at first. Some stopped coming, wanting only the perfection they had come to expect. But new customers arrived, people who understood wabi-sabi, who valued authenticity over perfection, who wanted to hold a bowl that felt alive rather than ideal. One day, years later, a young potter came to Fumiko's workshop seeking to apprentice. The young woman looked around at the various bowls and asked the question Fumiko had once silently asked herself. "Which of these is your best work?" Fumiko picked up a bowl that leaned noticeably to one side, its glaze running in unexpected rivulets, a clear fingerprint visible in the clay. "This one," she said, "not because it's most technically accomplished, but because it's most true. See this wobble? I made this bowl on a day when I was sad about something I can no longer remember. My hands were unsteady, and the clay recorded that unsteadiness. This isn't a flaw, it's a diary entry in clay. It's proof that I was alive, was feeling something, was human when I made it. She set the bowl down gently. For years, I made perfect bowls that could have been made by anyone with sufficient skill. But these imperfect bowls? These could only have been made by me, on these specific days, in these specific moments. The crooked bowls are my truest work because they hide nothing. They reveal everything, my moods, my doubts, my humanity, and in doing so, they give others permission to accept their own imperfection too. The young potter picked up the crooked bowl, feeling its uneven weight, seeing her own reflection distorted in its irregular glaze. "So, you're saying," she began slowly, "that the goal isn't perfection?" "The goal is presence," Fumiko replied. "When you're trying to be perfect, you're not really there. You're thinking about what you should be doing, what the result should look like, whether you're succeeding or failing. But when you let go of perfection and just engage fully with the material, with the process, with the moment, that's when you make something real. That's when your work becomes art instead of just craft." She smiled, remembering her father's perfect bowls, understanding now why she had needed to move beyond them. Perfection is impressive, but imperfection is honest. And in the end, honesty is more beautiful than perfection could ever be. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own crooked bowls, the parts of yourself you've been trying to perfect, to fix, to hide. What if those imperfections aren't flaws to be corrected, but signatures to be accepted? What if the wobble in your voice, the unevenness of your journey, the visible marks of your struggles are not evidence of failure, but proof of authentic living? You are not a machine-made bowl, smooth and perfect and identical to 1,000 others. You are handmade, unique, bearing the clear imprint of everything you've experienced. Your imperfections tell your story. They make you irreplaceable. Rest now in your own crooked beauty. Let yourself be imperfect, incomplete, impermanent. Let yourself be human. This is not a flaw in your design. This is the design itself, and it's more beautiful than perfection could ever be. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In the capital city, there was a mirror maker named Eiji, who had perfected his craft over decades. His mirrors were renowned for their clarity. When you looked into one of Eiji's mirrors, you saw yourself exactly as you were. No distortion, no wavering, no cloudiness. Just pure, clear reflection. But Eiji had a strange habit that puzzled his apprentices. After crafting each mirror, after polishing it to perfect clarity, he would sit before it for an hour just looking. Not at his own reflection, but at the mirror itself. Or so it seemed. When asked what he was doing, he would only smile and say, "I'm learning from it." One day, a young apprentice named Hana gathered her courage and asked directly, "Master, what does a mirror have to teach?" "It only reflects what's placed before it." Eiji gestured for her to sit beside him in front of a newly completed mirror. "Look at this mirror," he said. "What do you see?" "I see my reflection," Hana replied. "Yes. And what does the mirror think about your reflection?" Hana frowned. "Mirrors don't think." "Exactly. The mirror doesn't think you're beautiful or ugly. It doesn't judge you as good or bad. It doesn't prefer one face over another. It simply reflects what is without adding anything of its own. This is the mirror's teaching. He stood up and moved away, leaving the mirror empty of human reflections. Now what does it reflect? He asked. The wall behind it, the window, the light. And does it complain that the wall is less interesting than a human face? Does it wish the light would be different? Does it try to improve what it reflects? No, Hannah said slowly, beginning to understand. It just reflects whatever appears before it, without preference. This, A.G. said, sitting back down, is how I try to experience life. Like a mirror, awareness that reflects everything, without distortion, without judgment, without trying to change what appears. Hannah thought about this. But we're not mirrors. We have thoughts, feelings, preferences. We judge constantly. Yes, A.G. agreed, but beneath all those thoughts and judgments is pure awareness, the part of you that simply sees, simply knows, simply experiences without adding commentary. This awareness is like a mirror. It reflects your thoughts, but it doesn't judge them. It reflects your feelings, but it doesn't resist them. It reflects reality, but it doesn't try to change it into something else. He pointed to the mirror again. When you look in this mirror, it shows you exactly what you are in this moment. If you smile, it shows you smiling. If you frown, it shows you frowning. It doesn't try to make you smile when you're sad. It doesn't criticize you for frowning. It just faithfully, honestly, clearly reflects what is. Hannah stared at the mirror, seeing herself reflected there. She noticed how her mind immediately started judging what she saw. Her nose was too wide, her hair was messy, she looked tired. But the mirror itself held no such judgments. It simply showed her face with perfect neutrality. The suffering we create, A.G. continued, comes largely from our inability to be like mirrors. We see what is, and immediately we add our opinions about what is. We see a thought, and we judge it as good or bad. We see a feeling, and we resist it or cling to it. We see reality, and we compare it to how we think it should be. All of this is distortion, adding things that aren't really there. He stood and walked to where several mirrors stood in various stages of completion. He picked up one that was cloudy, its surface rough. "This mirror distorts," he said, showing Hannah the wavy, unclear reflection it produced. "When you look in it, you can't see yourself clearly. Your image is bent, confused. This is what our minds do when they're full of judgment and resistance and preferences. We can't see reality clearly because we're constantly bending it, distorting it, making it into something that confirms our beliefs." He set down the cloudy mirror and picked up one that was highly polished. "But this mirror," he held it up, showing Hannah her clear reflection, "adds nothing. It has no agenda. It doesn't care what appears before it. It just faithfully reflects moment by moment whatever is present. And in that faithful reflection, there's a kind of peace." Over the following weeks, Hannah began to practice what she called mirror awareness. When thoughts appeared in her mind, instead of immediately judging them or getting caught up in their content, she would try to simply reflect them, to be aware that thinking was happening without adding a second layer of thought about the first layer. When emotions arose, instead of immediately trying to push them away, or figure out why she was feeling them. She would try to simply reflect them, to notice that sadness was present or anger was present, the way a mirror might notice a cloud passing across its surface. It was harder than she expected. Her mind wanted to comment on everything, to judge, to analyze, to fix. But gradually, she learned to find that space of pure awareness beneath all the commentary. And she discovered that Eiji was right. There was a peace in simply reflecting reality without trying to change it. One evening, a wealthy merchant came to Eiji's workshop in great distress. He had commissioned an elaborate mirror for his home, but when Eiji delivered it, the merchant had rejected it. "This mirror makes me look old," the merchant complained. "It shows every flaw, every line on my face. I want a mirror that makes me look better." Eiji listened patiently, then said gently, "The mirror shows you exactly as you are. If you look old, it's because you are aging, as all humans do. The mirror doesn't judge this as good or bad. It simply reflects truth." "Then I don't want truth," the merchant said angrily. "I want to look young and handsome." "I could make you a distorted mirror," Eiji offered. "One that softens lines and changes proportions. It would lie to you, but perhaps that would make you happier." The merchant paused, realizing how foolish he sounded. He looked at himself in the clear mirror again, really looked. Yes, he was aging. Yes, there were lines on his face, but the mirror wasn't judging him. Only he was judging himself. "The mirror accepts you exactly as you are," Eiji said softly. "Perhaps you could learn to do the same." The merchant stood there for a long time, looking at his reflection without judgment, trying to see himself the way the mirror saw him. Just a face, just a person, just what is, without the weight of good or bad, young or old, handsome or ugly. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take the mirror," he said quietly. Years later, when Hana had become a master mirror maker herself, students would ask her the same question she had once asked Eiji. "What does a mirror have to teach?" And she would reply, just as Eiji had, "A mirror teaches us pure awareness. It shows us that we can experience life without constantly judging it, resisting it, trying to change it into something else. We can simply reflect what is, clearly and faithfully, without distortion. And in that clear reflection, we find a peace that judgment can never provide." She would hold up a polished mirror, turning it so light played across its surface. "Your deepest nature is like this mirror, pure awareness that reflects everything but clings to nothing, that sees everything but judges nothing, that accepts everything exactly as it is. When you can rest in this mirror-like awareness, even for a moment, you discover that peace doesn't depend on changing what you reflect. It depends on reflecting clearly, without adding the distortion of your own resistance and judgment." Tonight, as you rest, you might practice mirror awareness. Let thoughts appear and disappear like images crossing a mirror's surface. Let feelings rise and fall like reflections that come and go. Don't judge what appears. Don't try to change it. Just reflect it clearly, the way a mirror reflects light, faithfully, honestly, without adding anything of your own. You are not the content of your thoughts and feelings. You are the awareness that reflects them. And that awareness, like a perfect mirror, is always clear, always peaceful, always unchanged, by whatever passes across its surface. Rest in your mirror nature tonight. Reflect everything, cling to nothing, judge nothing. Just be aware, purely and simply aware, and let that awareness be enough. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? "It's everything I spent my life learning not to create." The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Nao reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included, rather than denied, imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Now, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitations stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. "Every limitation is a teacher," she would say. "It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't." My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. In a monastery nestled between two mountains, there lived a young monk named Koji who took his responsibilities with tremendous seriousness. Each morning before dawn, he was assigned the task of sweeping the courtyard, and he approached this simple chore as if the monastery's very survival depended on it. Koji would begin his work with fierce determination, moving in perfectly straight lines from one end of the courtyard to the other. His broom strokes were methodical, precise, leaving no stone unswept. He would work for hours, his jaw clenched with concentration, his movements sharp and controlled. But the courtyard sat beneath an ancient cherry tree, and the tree had its own ideas about cleanliness. Even as Koji swept, new leaves would drift down, landing exactly where he had just cleaned. The wind would scatter dust across his perfectly swept paths. Birds would drop small twigs and seeds onto the stones. Each new bit of debris felt like a personal insult to Koji. He would rush to sweep it up, only to see 3 more leaves fall behind him. His sweeping became more frantic, more desperate. He began waking earlier and earlier, trying to finish before the wind picked up, before the birds became active, before new leaves could fall. The other monks noticed Koji's growing exhaustion. They saw the tension in his shoulders, the frustration etched across his young face. But they said nothing. This was between Koji and his teacher, Master Tenzin. Master Tenzin had been watching his students struggle for several weeks. He saw how Koji was making himself miserable over a courtyard that would never stay perfectly clean. Could never stay perfectly clean, was not meant to stay perfectly clean. One morning, as Koji was finishing his 3rd hour of sweeping, his movements now mechanical and joyless, Master Tenzin appeared beside him. "Why do you sweep in straight lines?" the master asked, his voice mild, curious. Koji stopped, surprised by the question. "Because that's the most efficient way to cover the ground, master. Straight lines ensure I don't miss any area." "I see," Tenzin nodded thoughtfully. "And how is that working for you?" Koji wanted to say it was working fine, but honesty prevented him. "I can never seem to finish, master. As soon as I clean one section, another becomes dirty. The courtyard is never completely perfect." Tenzin made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else entirely. "Today, try something different. Sweep in circles instead." "Circles?" Koji couldn't hide his confusion. "But that's inefficient. Circles will overlap. I'll sweep the same areas multiple times. It doesn't make sense." "Try it anyway," Tenzin said gently. "Just for today. Sweep in circles and see what happens." Koji wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the logical reasons why circular sweeping was inferior to his systematic approach. But one did not argue with Master Tenzin. So he adjusted his grip on the broom and began to sweep in a large, slow circle. At first it felt wrong. His mind kept trying to straighten his path, to make it more efficient, more logical. But he continued, one circular sweep after another, round and round the courtyard. Something unexpected began to happen. Without the pressure to move in straight lines, to cover ground efficiently, to finish a measurable task, Koji's body started to relax. The circular motion became almost meditative, like a moving meditation. He noticed things he had missed during weeks of intense, focused sweeping. The way morning light caught the edges of wet stones, the sound his broom made, a soft whisper against the ground, the coolness of the air before the sun rose fully, the scent of cherry blossoms from the tree above. When a leaf fell in front of him, he swept it into his circle naturally. It became part of the dance rather than an interruption to his task. When the wind scattered dust behind him, he simply came round to it again on his next pass, unhurried, untroubled. After an hour of circular sweeping, Koji stopped and looked around. The courtyard wasn't perfectly clean. It couldn't be, but it was clean enough. It was cared for. And most surprisingly, Koji himself felt peaceful for the first time in weeks. Master Tenzin returned, as if he had known exactly when Koji would understand. "Well?" the master asked. "I don't understand," Koji admitted. "The courtyard isn't any cleaner than when I swept in straight lines. In fact, by logical measurement, it might be less clean, but somehow it feels right." "What changed?" Tenzin asked. Koji thought carefully. "I stopped trying to finish. Circles have no end point, so I couldn't race toward completion. I was just sweeping, being present with the broom, the stones, the leaves. The work itself became the point, not the finished product. And I realized the courtyard was never meant to be perfectly clean. It's outside, under a tree, in the world. Leaves will fall, wind will blow. This is natural, this is right. I was fighting against nature itself, trying to impose a perfection that doesn't exist." Tenzin smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to light up from somewhere deep inside. "For weeks, you've been at war with this courtyard, at war with leaves, at war with wind, at war with imperfection. How did that feel?" "Exhausting, Master. I was miserable. And now?" Koji looked down at his broom, at the courtyard with its scattered leaves and imperfect stones. "Now I understand that I'm not here to create perfection. I'm here to care for something that will never be perfect. And that's okay. That's actually the point." From that day forward, Koji swept in circles. Other monks noticed the change in him. Where once he had been tight and tense, now he seemed relaxed. Where once his sweeping had been grim duty, now it seemed almost like a dance. Students would sometimes ask him, "Isn't circular sweeping inefficient?" And Koji would smile and reply, "It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to achieve perfect cleanliness, then yes, it's inefficient. You'll fail either way, but you'll be miserable failing. If you're trying to be present, to care for something without attachment to perfect outcomes, then circles are the most efficient path of all." Years later, when Koji became a teacher himself, he would always observe how new students approached their tasks. When he saw someone fighting against imperfection, making themselves miserable in pursuit of an impossible standard, he would suggest they try moving in circles for a while. "Perfection is a straight line that doesn't exist," he would tell them. but presence, care, acceptance. These are circles that spiral deeper and deeper into understanding. Don't fight against the nature of things. Work with it. Dance with it. Sweep in circles until you understand that the imperfect is already perfect, exactly as it is. As you rest tonight, you might consider this teaching. Where in your life are you sweeping in rigid straight lines, exhausting yourself trying to achieve a perfection that doesn't exist? What would happen if you moved in circles instead? If you let go of the end point and simply engaged fully with the present moment, imperfection and all. The courtyard of your life will never be perfectly clean. Leaves will fall. Wind will blow. This is not failure. This is life. And when you stop fighting against it, when you sweep in circles with presence and care, you might discover that what you thought was imperfect was actually complete all along. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. On the coast of a small fishing village, there lived an old fisherman named Takeshi who had cast his nets into the sea for more than 50 years. While other fishermen in the village would return each day with boats full of fish, Takeshi's catch was often modest. Yet he seemed more content than any of them, humming to himself as he mended his nets, smiling at the horizon as if it were an old friend. The other fishermen couldn't understand it. They had newer boats, stronger nets, better equipment. They worked longer hours, went farther out to sea, employed every technique they knew to maximize their catch. Yet they always seemed worried about competition, worried about the weather, worried about next season, worried about whether they were catching enough. One day, a young fisherman named Hiro, ambitious and frustrated by his own mediocre catches despite his hard work, approached Takeshi as the old man sat mending his net on the dock. "Old uncle," Hiro said, using the term of respect though they weren't related. "May I ask you something?" Takeshi looked up, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Of course, young one. Sit." Hiro sat beside him, watching the old man's gnarled fingers work the net with practiced ease. "How do you stay so peaceful? Your catch is often smaller than ours, yet you never seem worried. You never seem to be rushing or striving. What is your secret?" Takeshi held up a section of his net, spreading it between his hands so the light came through the gaps. "Tell me, Hiro, what is a net made of?" Hiro looked at the net, confused by the simple question. "Rope, I suppose. Woven rope with knots." "Look closer," Takeshi said, shaking the net gently. "What else do you see?" Hiro studied it more carefully. The rope formed a pattern, yes, but between each strand. "Holes," he said. "The net is full of holes." "Exactly," Takeshi said, his eyes twinkling. "A net is more hole than rope, yes. The holes are what make it a net. Without the holes, it would just be a sheet of cloth, useless for catching fish." "I don't understand what this has to do with my question." Takeshi set down the net and looked out at the water. "When I was young, like you, I wanted to catch every fish in the sea. I would cast my net and then grip the rope so tightly, pulling hard, afraid that fish would escape. My hands would bleed from holding so tight. My arms would ache from pulling so hard. And you know what happened?" "What?" The fish would sense the violence of it, the desperation. The net would move through the water roughly, and fish would avoid it. Or they would escape through holes that my tight gripping actually made larger. The harder I tried to hold everything, the more I lost. Hiro leaned forward, interested now. One day, Takeshi continued, I was very tired. My hands hurt. My heart hurt from constant worry. I cast my net almost carelessly, too exhausted to grip tight, too worn out to pull hard. I just let the net sink naturally, let the current move it gently, and pulled it back with soft hands. And that day, my catch was the best I'd ever had. I don't see how that's possible, Hiro said. If you don't hold tight, won't everything escape? Takeshi picked up the net again. Watch. He held one section very tightly in his fist. When I clench like this, look what happens to the net. The holes close up, the rope bunches. The net becomes smaller, more rigid. Now watch. He opened his hand, holding the net loosely across his palm. See? The holes open, the net expands. It becomes larger, more flexible. It can hold more because I'm holding it less. He let the net rest on his lap and looked at Hiro with those eyes that had seen half a century of sunrises over water. This is true for fish, and it's true for everything else in life. The tighter we grip, the more we lose. The more desperately we hold on, the more brittle things become. But when we hold loosely, gently, with open hands, things stay naturally. But isn't that risky? Hiro asked. What if everything falls through? What is falling through right now? Takeshi asked gently. You have a boat. You have nets. You have your health. You have this sea. What exactly are you afraid of losing that you don't already risk losing by worrying about it constantly? Hiro had no answer. He realized he spent so much energy protecting what he had, so much effort trying to guarantee future security, that he was exhausted and unhappy even though nothing had actually gone wrong yet. I see in you what I was, Takeshi said. You grip your life with tight fists. Your boat, your catch, your reputation, your future. You're trying to hold all of it so tightly that your hands hurt and your heart is tired. But you cannot control the sea. You cannot control the fish. You cannot control tomorrow. The only thing your tight grip accomplishes is making you suffer today. So what should I do? Hiro asked. Cast your net with care, but without desperation. Pull it back with attention, but without force. Let the sea be the sea. Let the fish be the fish. Do your work, do it well, but hold the results loosely. Some days the catch will be good, some days it will be modest, some days the net will come back empty. All of this is part of fishing, part of life. When you stop fighting against this truth, when you stop gripping so tightly, something relaxes. And often, that's when everything you need comes naturally. Hiro sat with this teaching for a long time, watching the waves, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. He thought about how tightly he had been holding everything in his life, his ambitions, his worries, his plans, his fears. His whole body ached from the effort of it. The next morning, when Hiro went out to fish, he tried something different. He cast his net with the same care as always, but without the desperate energy he usually brought. He didn't clench the ropes. He didn't pull with all his might. He simply allowed the net to do what a net does, and he guided it gently back to the boat. His catch that day wasn't dramatically bigger, But he noticed something else. The work felt easier. His shoulders didn't ache as much. His mind wasn't churning with anxiety. And when some fish escaped through the holes, which they always did, which they always would, he didn't feel it as a personal failure. It was just fish being fish. Over time, Hero's entire approach to fishing changed. And gradually, his entire approach to life changed with it. He held his plans more loosely. He gripped his expectations less tightly. He let people in his life be who they were without trying to control them. He stopped trying to grip the future with tight fists. Years later, young fishermen would come to Hero, asking the same question he had once asked Takeshi, and he would show them a net, spreading it in the light, teaching them about the holes that make it work. Life is like this net, he would say. It's mostly empty space, mostly things we cannot hold or control. And that's not a problem. That's what makes it work. Hold everything loosely, your work, your relationships, your achievements, your plans. Hold them with care, yes, but without that desperate grip that closes up the holes and makes everything smaller, harder, more brittle. Open your hands. Let life flow through them. You'll lose some things, yes, but you'll find you can hold so much more when you stop holding so tightly. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you might notice where you're gripping too tightly. What are you holding with clenched fists? What are you trying to control that cannot be controlled? What would happen if you opened your hands just a little and held everything more gently? The net of your life is mostly holes, mostly space, mostly mystery. This is not a flaw in the design. This is what makes it work. Hold it loosely. Let the holes be holes. Let some things escape. You cannot catch everything, and you were never meant to. But what stays when you hold it gently stays because it wants to, not because you forced it. And that makes all the difference. In a mountain monastery, there hung an ancient bronze bell in the temple courtyard. For 300 years, this bell had marked the rhythms of monastic life, calling monks to meditation at dawn, to meals at midday, to evening prayers as the sun set behind the peaks. Its deep, resonant tone could be heard throughout the valley, a voice of bronze that spoke of continuity, of tradition, of the sacred order of things. The monastery's youngest monk, a boy named Jiro, who had arrived only months before, had never known silence. He had grown up in a busy city where noise was constant. Street vendors calling, cartwheels clattering, neighbors arguing, merchants haggling, temple bells of a dozen different shrines all competing to be heard. When he came to the monastery, that single bell had seemed like a blessing. Just one sound, pure and clear, marking time with dignity. But Jiro took the bell for granted. He had heard it so many times that he no longer really heard it at all. It was just background, just part of the environment, no more remarkable than the sound of wind or the call of birds. When it rang for dawn meditation, he would stumble from his sleeping mat, still half asleep. When it rang for meals, he was often already hungry and irritated by the wait. The bell was just a signal, a command, nothing more. One autumn, the monastery's abbot, a man named Eshun, who rarely spoke but seemed to notice everything, made an unusual decision. Without explanation or announcement, he ordered that the bell should not be rung. Not for one day, but indefinitely. The bell ringer, a senior monk who had performed this duty for 20 years, looked confused but obeyed. The next morning, Jiro woke in darkness, unsure of the time. He lay there waiting for the familiar sound that would tell him dawn had arrived, that it was time to rise, time to begin the day. But no sound came. He waited longer, growing anxious. Had he somehow slept through it? Was he late? Would he be in trouble? Finally, he stumbled out into the courtyard and found other monks there, all looking similarly confused. Some had woken too early and been waiting. Others, like Jiro, had woken late, uncertain. Master Eishun appeared and said only, "No bell today. Perhaps no bell tomorrow. We shall see. Now please sit for meditation." They sat, but Jiro found it almost impossible to concentrate. He kept listening for the bell. His body expected it. His mind waited for it. Even though he knew it wouldn't ring, he couldn't stop anticipating its sound. The silence where the bell should have been was louder than the bell itself had ever been. At midday, there was no bell to call them to their meal. Some monks arrived too early and had to wait. Others came too late and found the food already distributed. The careful rhythm of the day, which had been marked by the bell for 300 years, had suddenly disappeared. Time became elastic, uncertain, strange. Evening came with no bell to mark the day's transition into night. Jiro sat in the courtyard, looking at the bell hanging silent in its wooden frame. He had passed this bell dozens of times each day for months. But he realized now that he had never really looked at it. Now, in its silence, he saw it clearly for the first time. He noticed the beautiful patina of the bronze, the way 3 centuries of weather had given it a green-black color that seemed to hold depth, like looking into deep water. He saw the intricate decorations cast into its surface, dragons and lotus flowers, and Sanskrit characters worn smooth by time. He noticed how the bell hung perfectly balanced, how the slightest touch would set it swinging, ready to speak at any moment, but choosing silence instead. Days passed, then weeks. The monks adapted to life without the bell. They learned to sense the time from the light, from the position of shadows, from the feeling in their own bodies. They became more attentive to natural rhythms, rather than relying on the bronze voice to tell them what to do. But something else happened too. The bell's absence created a different kind of presence. Monks found themselves thinking about it constantly. The silence, where the bell should have been, became a teaching in itself. One evening, Jiro approached Master Eishun in the garden. "Master," he said, bowing, "may I ask why the bell no longer rings?" Eishun looked up from the herbs he was tending. "Does it not ring? Or do you finally hear it?" Jiro frowned, confused. "I hear nothing, Master. That's the problem. The bell is silent." "Sit," Eishun said, gesturing to the ground beside him. Jiro sat. "When the bell rang every day," Eishun said, "did you hear it?" "Of course, Master. We all heard it." "Did you really?" "Tell me about the sound. Describe it to me." Jiro opened his mouth and found he couldn't. He had heard the bell hundreds of times, but he couldn't describe its tone, its resonance, its particular voice. He had heard it so often that he had stopped actually listening. "You heard the command," Eishun said gently. "Wake up. Come here. Do this. But did you hear the bell itself? Did you appreciate its voice? Did you feel gratitude for its faithful service?" Or had it become invisible to you, just part of the background noise of your life? Jiro felt something catch in his throat. The master was right. He had taken the bell completely for granted. Now, Eshun continued, now that it's silent, you think about it constantly. You notice it. You see it hanging there. You appreciate what it was. The absence has taught you to see what presence never could. This is why the bell is silent. Not because I wanted to take it away from you, but because I wanted to give it back to you. Sometimes we must lose something to truly find it. Jiro looked at the bell hanging in the courtyard, silhouetted against the darkening sky. He understood now. When the bell rang, it was just a tool, just a function. But in its silence, it had become a teacher. There is another lesson here, Eshun said, standing up and brushing dirt from his robes. We spend our lives filling every moment with sound, with activity, with doing. We are afraid of silence, afraid of absence, afraid of empty space. But silence teaches, absence reveals. The spaces between notes are what make music music. The pauses between words are what make speech meaningful. The rest between breaths is what makes breathing possible. He started walking toward the temple, then paused and looked back at Jiro. The bell will ring again someday. But when it does, I hope you will hear it differently. I hope you will hear not just the sound, but the silence it emerges from. Not just the command it carries, but the gift it offers. And I hope you will remember that sometimes the deepest teaching comes not from what is present, but from what is absent. That night, lying on his sleeping mat, Jiro listened to the silence, where the bell should have been. But it wasn't really silence, he realized. He could hear wind moving through trees. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the small sounds of the monastery settling into sleep. These sounds had always been there, but the bell had covered them. Its absence revealed a whole world of subtle sound he had never noticed. 3 months later, on the first morning of winter, Master Ishan gave the signal. The bell rang again. The sound that rolled across the courtyard was the most beautiful thing Jiro had ever heard. It was deep and rich and full of resonance. It spoke of time and patience and faithful service. It spoke of continuity and change. It spoke of presence and absence, sound and silence, all woven together. Tears came to Jiro's eyes as he listened. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of finally, truly hearing something he had taken for granted for so long. From that day forward, every time the bell rang, Jiro would pause, really pause, and listen. And in listening to the bell, he learned to listen to everything more deeply. He learned that things reveal themselves most fully when we risk losing them. He learned that absence can be a kind of presence. He learned that what we take for granted becomes invisible until it's taken away. Years later, when Jiro became the bell ringer himself, he would sometimes let a full day pass in silence, just as Master Eshun had done. The younger monks would complain, would feel lost without their marker, their signal, their command. And Jiro would smile, remembering his own confusion, his own eventual understanding. The bell is always teaching, he would tell them, in sound and in silence, in presence and in absence. When you learn to hear both, you begin to understand that they are not opposites, but partners in the same dance. As you settle into rest tonight, you might notice what's absent from this moment, not in a sad way, but with curiosity. What sounds are you not hearing? What worries are not present right now? What problems are not demanding your attention in this very instant? Absence has gifts to offer. The space where sound isn't is what makes sound possible. The silence where words aren't is what makes words meaningful. The emptiness where thought isn't is what makes awareness possible. Let yourself rest in what's not here, not as loss, but as space. Empty space, silent space, open space. And in that space, you might discover a presence more profound than anything that makes noise or demands attention. You might discover that sometimes the deepest teaching, the deepest rest, the deepest peace comes not from adding something, but from letting something fall away. The bell is silent now, and in that silence, everything speaks. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.